Across the country, dozens of lawsuits continue to play out that could have sweeping impacts on how the Trump administration governs. After a slew of executive orders aimed at border security, government funding, and mass layoffs, the courtroom has become one of the only ways for opponents of the president to fight back. And in a major blow to President Trump and Elon Musk's crusade to slash the size of the federal government, two federal judges yesterday ruled the administration must reinstate thousands of fired federal employees across more than a dozen agencies. Plus, Trump looks to the Supreme Court again, this time in an effort to end birthright citizenship. Here to help us catch up on the latest in court cases across the U.S., the Hill's courts and legal reporter Zach Schonfeld, co-author of the Gavel newsletter, a must-read addition to your email inbox. Zach, let's discuss the latest rulings from the two federal judges yesterday. The Trump administration has been ordered to reinstate probationary employees who were fired. How broad are these dual rulings, and what's next for the employees?
Hey, Drew, these rulings are pretty broad. The first ruling from a judge in San Francisco that covered 6 different federal agencies, and then the ruling that came down hours later from a federal judge in Maryland that added an additional dozen agencies. So not quite everywhere in the federal government, but we're talking about large swaths of federal agencies. So we're talking about thousands of employees here who now, under these rulings in the next few days, will be reinstated and returned to work. But I do think it's important to point out that these judges have been stressing that the problem here is that the Trump administration had not been conducting these layoffs of probationary employees in the right way. So the judges have made clear that if the administration is really intent on laying off these employees, if they follow the proper procedures, they probably will be able to do so. So yes, these workers will get to go back to work and they'll be getting paychecks again, but this isn't the end of the road.
Next up, Trump is taking his shot at the Supreme Court again, filing a series of emergency appeals in an effort to end birthright citizenship. For now, justices aren't considering whether Trump's move to end birthright citizenship is constitutional, right? What's actually before the court and what are the implications?
Yeah, that's right. At this stage of the case, this does not deal with whether Trump's executive order is actually constitutional and complies with the 14th Amendment. This instead is a question that deals with what is known as a nationwide injunction. It's a question that keeps coming up to the Supreme Court. There's really been a rise of these over the last decade or so. And it's when these singular federal district judges find that something the president did is unlawful or unconstitutional, they then issue oftentimes an order that blocks that policy nationwide. So what the Trump administration is arguing is that district judges don't have that authority, and that instead their relief needs to be limited to the actual specific plaintiffs in a case who are suing. So we've seen this play out in the birthright citizenship context. There have been 10 different lawsuits across the country, and in many of these, we've seen federal judges block Trump's policy nationwide. So now the Trump administration has gone to the Supreme Court, asking the justices to narrow those lower court rulings for now and only limit it to the specific plaintiffs that sue. Of course, there is that big question, though, of the 14th Amendment. That, too, could get to the Supreme Court. It's just not quite there yet.
Yeah, and in a case that you have been following closely, there is a hearing today on the effort by the Trump administration to destroy classified documents at USAID. What can we expect with that?
Yeah, this has really just been bubbling up over the last few days or so, with these plaintiffs now in multiple cases raising alarm that there has been instructions from Trump administration officials to USAID to destroy classified and personnel records and to shred them and burn some of those in a very rapid fashion. So we've seen some existing lawsuits over USAID plaintiffs have raised, but the hearing that's going to be taking place this afternoon is an entirely new lawsuit that has been filed over this potential document destruction. So I'm interested to see, because in some of these other cases where we've seen judges talk about this, the government has given some assurances that they're not destroying more documents and that they'll give notice before they do so. So it'll be interesting to see if that same dynamic plays out in this hearing later today, which, by the way, will be before U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan, who a lot of people know because she oversaw Donald Trump's criminal case here in Washington, D.C. when that was going.
All right, lots of action in the courts. Thanks for the update, Zach Schonfeld.
Thanks, Drew.
Make sure to go to thehill.com and sign up for the Gavel weekly newsletter to keep up to date on the latest court cases playing out across the U.S. Some top Democrats seemingly extending an olive branch to the Trump administration this week as several blue state governors head to the White House to meet with the president. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer paid a visit on Thursday night, and New York Governor Kathy Hochul stopped by Friday morning. It comes as Democrats in Congress are meeting in Virginia for their annual retreat, one of the top priorities, coming up with a plan to oppose Trump's agenda. For more details, we're bringing in national political reporter Julia Manchester. Julia, Whitmer met with Trump Thursday. She said the meeting was productive. Do we know what they talked about?
Well, she says they talked about tariffs, they talked about keeping the Great Lakes clean, so maybe some environmental issues. But look, I mean, it was a very positive message from Whitmer coming out of that meeting because we know that, especially during campaign season, she's been a very staunch critic of President Trump. But it seems like they've found some common ground. And for Michigan, I think that's really needed. We know that Michigan, for example, is a swing state. We know that a lot of Michigan Governor Whitmer's constituents, for example, could have voted for her and also voted for Trump. So it sounds like it was a productive meeting. She's not the first Democratic governor to have met with President Trump. We know that Governor Gavin Newsom from California met with him earlier this year in an effort to secure wildfire aid to the Los Angeles area. So we certainly are seeing, fewer Democratic governors put up this wall of resistance. They seem willing to reach across the aisle and chat with Trump.
And Governor Hochul met with Trump earlier today. The two administrations have kind of clashed a lot lately. They clashed over immigration, the charges against Eric Adams, New York City congestion pricing. There's this pipeline issue. What do you think Hochul is looking for from the Trump administration and vice versa?
Well, look, obviously New York, even though it's not a swing state, it's a very blue state. There's obviously going to be differences between a Republican governor and a Republican president, and a New York governor. But look, I think they're trying to find some common ground somewhere on an issue like the pipeline, for example. I mean, this is something, that a lot of Democrats in New York have expressed environmental concerns about. But at the same time, though, Republicans would argue, and maybe some Democrats too, that the pipeline that would go in New York and aid not only New York, but many New England states, including Connecticut, could economically benefit New York. So I think they're trying to find some common benefit there. I would say that a real point of contention could potentially be this idea of congestion prices. We know that she's the one who is trying to, push this policy through, trying to lower congestion while at the same time fund transportation costs and infrastructure costs in New York. But Trump has really pushed back against that very publicly. Remember, there was that image that he put out there, essentially on X or his platform Truth Social, depicting himself as a king. And Hochul responded to this a few months ago saying, well, I'll see you in court. So that's a point of contention there. I'm curious to see if they made any common ground there.
Shifting over to Congress, House Democrats are wrapping up that policy retreat in Virginia, regrouping on their strategy for opposing the Trump administration. Some are calling for town hall style events to ramp up, especially in GOP district. Reminds me of the Tea Party back after the 2008 election. Is that going to be a focus in the months and even years moving forward, and especially leading up into the midterm elections?
Look, Democrats need to find out what works right now. They don't know what works right now, and they don't have a strategy moving forward. I think last year's election, it was a blowout for Republicans, so they're trying to regroup, and I think they've pinpointed what they believe is a weakness among Republicans, and it's these town halls. We know that there's been a number of viral moments from a number of these districts, sometimes states, where senators and House lawmakers have been really put on the spot by a number of their constituents. Now, Republicans will say this is manufactured. Those are Democratic agitators or activists. Still, though, it is a negative look for Republicans. We know that the head of the House Republican campaign arm has encouraged House Republicans not to participate in those town halls. So this is a way for Democrats to sort of hit them where they are weakest right now and hope they have more of these viral moments.
Not having the town halls could be a political risk, too, if you're seen as not being willing to face your constituents. Back at the White House, Trump yesterday doubled down on his bid for acquiring Greenland. Here's what he had to say alongside the NATO Secretary General.
We've been dealing with Denmark, we've been dealing with Greenland, and we have to do it. We really need it for national security. I think that's why NATO might have to get involved in a way, because we really need Greenland for national security. It's very important.
Greenlanders seem to favor independence. Are administration officials taking these this move by Trump, these comments from Trump, seriously?
Look, Trump isn't letting it up, and I think there's a strategic impact here. And you heard the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in that meeting yesterday sort of echo this, even though he's saying NATO is not getting involved with this, but saying that there is strategic interest in Greenland and the Arctic Circle because we know Russia and China are trying to grow their influence in the region. So I think that's where Trump is coming at this from. You know, it does seem like an extraordinary idea for the United States to acquire Greenland. You know, I don't know how that would necessarily work, but strategically, he wants to have some sort of influence in that region, and this is how he's going about it.
Marco Rubio is in Quebec for the G7 meeting. It's got to be a pretty awkward situation for him to go into, considering some of the criticisms the Trump administration has had for European allies and other G7 members. Rubio says Trump's plan to make Canada a 51st state is not something that's going to be on the table. They're going to be talking about tariffs and a Ukraine deal. What do you expect to come out of this meeting?
Well, look, Rubio has to approach this very delicately, as does any diplomat, but particularly a diplomat in the Trump administration or a second Trump administration. You know, you have Trump, making these comments talking about the governor of Canada being a 51st state, making these jokes almost online, in person. And it's agitating, understandably, a lot of Canadians, obviously. So Rubio is going in there sort of taking a softer approach, taking the administration's stance on tariffs, but maybe adding some, a sweetener into the conversation, trying to, further negotiate without the brashness of Trump. Now, Trump could make Rubio's job harder in all of this, but in terms of the conversation, I think a lot of it's going to be focused, obviously, on economics, tariffs, as well as immigration. That's where the Trump administration is trying to put pressure on Canada. But like you said, these comments about the 51st state, et cetera, aren't doing much to help the U.S.'s cause here.
Interesting to see what comes out of that. Julia Manchester, national political reporter, thanks so much.
Thank you.
The former surgeon and daytime TV host Dr. Mehmet Oz testifying before the Senate Finance Committee today as he seeks Senate confirmation to head up the agency in charge of Medicare and Medicaid. Oz ran to be a member of the Senate back in 2022 and was endorsed by President Trump. Now he's Trump's pick to oversee nearly $1.5 trillion in federal spending. NewsNation's Joe Khalil was in the hearing room this morning and has the latest.
The administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, typically not a high-profile position. That will be different if Dr. Mehmet Oz is ultimately confirmed for it. This is a person who obviously comes with his own celebrity, but with that, also a heightened level of scrutiny right now, not just because of his persona, but also because we're in a moment now where you've got a lot of Democratic lawmakers and some Republican lawmakers concerned about what happens with Medicaid as the Trump administration continues its efforts to scale back the size and scope of the federal government and lay off federal workers. There are concerns about where that is going to leave Medicaid. I got to say, inside the hearing room, he did address that almost immediately. He said that President Trump, and then therefore he as administrator, would not be cutting those services. But again, those concerns still persist here. Dr. Oz was a physician before he was a TV personality in the 90s, sort of making his name in that way. And then ultimately he became a marketer for a lot of medical products and dietary supplements as well. In addition to that, he has amassed a pretty decent fortune. He's a multimillionaire. He's got several ties financially to a number of corporations and groups in the medical space. That was a concern. That is something that, as we continue to hear questions, is brought up here. Also, his vocal support for Medicare Advantage, which is essentially a privatized version of Medicare. That also is a concern. Take a listen here to some of the exchanges that we heard inside the room.
Will you agree to oppose cuts in the Medicaid program?
I cherish Medicaid, and I've worked within the Medicaid environment quite extensively, as I highlighted, practicing at Columbia University.
That's not the question, Doctor. The question is, will you oppose cuts to this program you say you cherish? Time's short.
I want to make sure that the patients today and in the future have resources to protect them if they get ill. The way you protect Medicaid is by making sure that it's viable at every level.
This is an incredibly important position to be administrator. We know Medicare, Medicaid Services, something like 160 million Americans all across the country. This is a budget of $1.5 trillion. And again, as we continue to see how the efforts of DOGE progress, there are going to be questions about staffing at the agency and also its budget. So those things left to be seen. But whatever President Trump's goals are and whatever leverage he has in making those changes happen, it would be Dr. Oz to administer them should he ultimately be confirmed.
NewsNation's Joe Khalil, thank you. The U.S. Postal Service striking a deal Friday with the Trump administration's Department of Government Efficiency, agreeing to cut costs at the agency. In a letter to congressional leaders, Postmaster General Louis DeJoy saying that the post office has spent the past 4 years working to halt financial losses, but he says the agency is still not achieving its goals. DeJoy laid out that he signed a deal with DOGE and the General Services Administration to identify and achieve further efficiencies. He says the post office plans to reduce its workforce by 10,000 workers over the next month through an early retirement program. This is the first time DOGE's reach has extended to the historically independent agency. It comes after DeJoy announced just last month that he would be stepping down in the near future. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.